بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
So in the spirit of togetherness, after a year plus of isolation, the topic I decided to try and touch on is brotherhood/sisterhood in Islam. And the main reference for this, as far as material goes, will be a small publication called The Duties of Brotherhood in Islam, which is an excerpt from the monumental work 𝘾𝙊𝙉𝙍𝙍 by Imam Ghazali, rahimahullah. This was translated by Muhtar Holland. It was one of his final translations as he returned to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not long ago. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward him immensely. He was truly a amazing contributor to the literary works and translations from classical works into English. I would like to preface this series by just pointing out that this is not necessarily a traditional formal study of the text mentioned. Rather, this is simply a series on brotherhood that will be utilizing this text as a reference, source material. It's truly an introduction to the topic and the text in a sense. As a listener, the hope is that this series will serve as an inspiration to be more brotherly or sisterly to one another, to fulfill that right and responsibility as a community member in your respective community. But it can also be looked at as a preview to this particular book or Imam Ghazali's wider works. Definitely not time wasted to go and delve into those materials, as they are classical and amazing in their own right. The distinction I'm trying to draw here is that this book, inshallah, is source material for the topic, and we will share a number of inferences and experiences, examples going forward on this topic. That being said, the niyyah is pretty straightforward. In a time when we are not mingling together as much or sharing those community gatherings or experiences with congregational prayers being adjusted and modified, tarawih all across the nation being adjusted and modified, questions around large gatherings. The one thing that we really miss out on is that brotherhood and sisterhood, just the simple ability to meet one another, greet one another, say salamu alaikum, catch up, learn things about one another. That is altogether absent for the most part, and so we want to rekindle that. So if the takeaway from this is that we begin to reach out to one another more, call each other more, or text each other, that's a good thing, as long as we're doing that with the right intention and in hopes of, creating a stronger bond for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure. Additionally, we want to further enhance our understanding of what it truly means to be a brother or sister in Islam to one another, specifically towards our fellow Muslims who we might not be related to by blood. This is truly a unique aspect of our deen historically from the beginning and even through the ages until now. I'm sure many of the listeners can relate to a deep love that we have for one another as fellow Muslims without having kinship bonds. This is something that Imam Ghazali stresses heavily in this work, and we want to start there. So without further ado, let's get into it, inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. So the first place to start is to just mention briefly Imam Ghazali, his bio. It's truly a tall task. I am certain I won't do it justice, so I encourage every listener to learn more about the Shaykh and find out what you can. There's documentaries out there. There's a multitude of works on this person, this personality. He's truly a legend of Islam. He's considered the mujaddid of the ummah of his time, and well worth looking into. But Imam Ghazali, in short, he was around about 448 years after Hijri, roughly places him at 1056-57 of the Common Era. This is what most modern historians consider to be accurate. His full name is Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad at-Tusi al-Shafi'i al-Ghazali. He lived during the Seljuk dynasty period, and during his time, he was a notable student turned into a professor in some of the major colleges established by the main vizier of the Sultan of the day. This vizier is referred to as Nizam al-Mulk in history, and Imam Ghazali was outstanding in a number of fields. He was an expert in law, theology, and philosophy, and he established the superiority of Islamic teachings over competing worldviews, namely philosophy. And his hallmark work in that effort was titled Incoherence of the Philosophers. Imam Ghazali himself is considered a philosopher amongst philosophers. He did this by committing himself to becoming a master of something that he himself knew was flawed. And this is quite amazing. I mean, I have to take a second and geek out here. I'm hoping any younger listeners can appreciate this. But Imam Ghazali essentially studied objectively the science of philosophy and mastered it to the point where he ended up writing a book on the objective study of philosophy, and he explained it so well that the philosophers of his time felt that he was a pro-philosophy scholar. They began to celebrate that from amongst the Muslims comes a man who has explained philosophy so well that the Muslims themselves will not be able to survive questioning their own religion and their own tradition. And he did this intentionally to get validation from them. And then as soon as he got that validation, he actually released a second publication, which he had also accomplished, which was the Incoherence of the Philosophers. I mean, it's mind-boggling to me how dedicated he was. And subhanAllah, he till this day is considered one of the greatest philosophers in human history. He essentially got the credit for becoming a philosopher or being a masterful philosopher. And once he got that, he released his second work to debunk philosophy and point out its flaws and set Islamic teachings and Islamic tradition apart from that. Aside from all of his academic achievements, he is best known for a journey of self-reformation. Imam Ghazali, at some point in his life, after achieving all that he had achieved and getting that notoriety and reaching the heights of academia and status as a scholar, he decided to basically eliminate his ego. And he went on a retreat, a spiritual retreat. He left all that he had attained. He separated himself from his belongings, his family, and he set out to reform himself, to become essentially a true believer. And he accomplished that by following the traditional teachings that are generally referred to as the teachings of tasawwuf today. And as a seeker, he reformed himself mainly by way of abstinence and devotional worships. This second version of Imam Ghazali that surfaced after this hiatus he took really blew his peers away. People recognized that there was a significant change in him as a scholar. His level of thinking, the wisdom that he shared was just next level at this point. And so ultimately he was given the title, or the honorary title of Hujjatul Islam, the proof of Islam, meaning that people who encountered Imam Ghazali or engaged with him or had discourse with him, attended a lecture, listened to his reasoning or debate, they would be floored, and they would consider Islam the truth, that Islam is the truth because it was able to produce the likes of Imam Ghazali. It's said about him that once his teachings became common, that Islamic education and institutions were never the same, and they had set themselves apart from any other form of teaching or worldview for centuries. So it's truly an amazing person and accomplished so much. and we stand to benefit from his works in so many ways, on so many levels. And so to get right into it now, I wanted to focus on a line from the foreword of this book. It reads, "One of the greatest blessings of Islam is its admirable success in creating strong, warm, rich, and durable bonds of love and brotherhood." And I add the phrase, by proxy, sisterhood. My hope is that although this is a text that focuses mainly on brotherhood, a lot of it is applicable to our fellow sisters in Islam as well. Similar to many verses in the Quran that are addressing the men primarily, there's more often than not a secondary meaning or a secondary message there for the sisters as well. Now, this concept of camaraderie, brotherhood, sisterhood is not exclusive to Islam. Many people throughout the ages have identified with this. I mean, today, to use some modern examples, oftentimes you'll hear people who play for the same team will identify with the concept of brotherhood or togetherness. People who live in the same neighborhood sometimes can have a similar passion or have a mutual agreement around something and come together and experience some form of brotherhood or sisterhood or togetherness. But when it comes to Islam, we should always remember that when we associate our experiences with the remembrance of Allah, when we are intentional about connecting whatever it is that we are doing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure, or creating a niyyah of ibadah or good deed, this enhances that thing, whatever it might be. So take, for example, a gathering. There could be a gathering for, let's say, a sporting event, and people come together to watch something. And in that moment, over the course of that hour, they might feel very close and together on the same wavelength. They may even look back at that moment and say, "Oh, wow, that was amazing. That was such a good time. I've never had so much fun," etc. But when people come together and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is part of that equation, meaning that they say salam to one another, they abide by the guidelines set by Allah and His Messenger, they pray together, they recognize the rights each one of them has over the other, then that nostalgia, that feeling, that happiness, that extends beyond this life. It goes into the akhirah, because the value of that gathering is eternal. It could never ever be dismissed or belittled. And inshallah, with the proper niyyah, we can really maximize each and every gathering. And so it's important to remember this, that when we do something for the sake of Allah, whatever it might be, if you're a student and you're studying and you connect your late night study or your review of your material in order to earn a good grade or accomplish a degree, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is part of that equation, that you're doing this to fulfill the teachings of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam by seeking an education, or doing this to achieve the credentials in order to give back to your community, to serve the community, to be in khidmah of some sort, because this is pleasing to Allah, then that entire journey would be rewarded, and it would have a special barakah in it. And that's something that we should always remember, no matter what our line of work is, whatever it is that we are engaged in. Even the most mundane task, cleaning your own home, just a chore, you can make the niyyah that you're doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that this is in line with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects of you. Then that would be something that can serve as a good deed and earn the pleasure of Allah, increase you in proximity to Allah, and ultimately give success on the Day of Judgment. We should never forget that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself engaged in the most mundane of things. He did his own chores, he sewed his own shoes. There's so many examples, and the Sahaba, they were no stranger to manual labor, whether it was on their farm or serving as merchants, traveling, etc. All of this was for the sake of Allah. So it's very important to remember this. Now, why do I point that out? Well, today in the modern world, there is a immense amount of loneliness, even though we are quote-unquote connected by way of text messaging or chit chat over the phone, being in the same WhatsApp group or Facebook page. We claim that we're connected, that from even by way of GPS we can see where our friends are and this and that. But in reality, there's still a huge gap between the togetherness of today and the togetherness of yesterday. The care and concern that people, and I'm thinking of the Sahaba radiallahu anh right now, the care and concern that they had for one another, that they would visit each other, they would break bread together, and that all those things had a process behind them. When we meet today, even as friends, let's just focus on the youth for a second. They might, grab a bite, but what is that exactly? I mean, it's a fast food meal. It doesn't involve much from each party. They meet up, grab a coffee, grab a bite. They talk about superficial things more often than not. And then in the midst of that, there might be some real personal exchange. If you think back in the olden days, people would have to cook for one another. People would have to serve one another. And over the course of doing that, there's bonds that are created. I mean, there's so many examples. I'm thinking of the Sahabi who went to another Sahaba and said, I need shelter for a few nights. Can I stay with you? And that Sahaba opened his door for his fellow brother to stay with him. And so he's sleeping and eating. He's sleeping in the same room. He's eating. He's breaking bread. He's praying with his brother. It's a little different than what we're accustomed to today. We might have seasonal experiences like this in Ramadan, inshallah, towards the end. If there is, i'tikaf this year, maybe that can be experienced. But the richness, the actual substance of those relationships and the level of sacrifice people made for one another is a bit different. And so in the era of mistrust, isolation, lack of interaction, courtesy, despite so much access and communication, sometimes it feels like we're further away from each other than ever before. And one simply needs to look back at historical examples. And even in present day, most of us, on some level, can relate to the concept of brotherhood in our community of circle of friends. The idea is that we want to try and expand that as much as we can. We want to take those snapshots that Allah allows us to experience by His mercy and build on that. We want our children, inshallah, to see, for instance, that my father, my mother, my brother, my sister, they have deep and meaningful relationships with people in the community. And those are examples for me to try and live by. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in the Quran, in Surah 49, Surah Al-Hujurat, ayah number 10, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةٌ فَأَصْلِحُوا بَيْنَ أَخَوَيْكُمْ وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ. The believers are but one brotherhood, so make peace between your brothers, and be mindful of Allah, so you may be shown mercy. Imam Ghazali has an amazing opening quote in relation to this concept. He states, "Know that the contract of brotherhood is a bond between two persons, like the contract of marriage between two spouses. For just as marriage gives rise to certain duties which must be fulfilled when it is entered into, so does the contract of brotherhood. Confer upon your brother a certain right relating to your property, your person, your tongue, and your heart, by way of forgiveness, prayer, sincerity, loyalty, relief, and considerateness." So, Imam Ghazali obviously has a very high, noble outlook and understanding of what brotherhood truly means. And in order for us to try and build on what we already know, we have to be open to expanding our understanding of it. And the Shaykh in this excerpt, he really does just that. He cites a number of examples, and we will try our best to mention those that are applicable, but we'll also mention some more modern examples or phenomenon of Muslim brotherhood or sisterhood amongst our own community. And I leave you today with the dua of Musa alayhi salam for his brother, and I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts. رَبِّ اغْفِرْ لِي وَلِأَخِي وَأَدْخِلْنَا فِي رَحْمَتِكَ وَأَنْتَ أَرْحَمُ الرَّاحِمِينَ. Musa prayed, alayhi salam, "My Lord, forgive me and my brother, and admit us into your mercy. You are the most merciful of the merciful. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept this from all of us and allow us to benefit. Inshallah, stay tuned for the next episode. Inshallah, we'll jump right in and cover 2 chapters from this book and try to apply it to this day and age. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
أجبت دعاء نوح فانتصر وحملته في فلكك المشحون يا من أحال النار حول خليله روحا وريحانا